Listening Fanfiction presents Indomitable Heart by Renette. Based off the movie series Star Wars from Lucasfilms and more currently Disney. Narrated for you by Sierra Feast. Warning. This story contains a foreign language. Mando'a. I have done some research in how to pronounce the various sentences and commonly used words, but it does mean that sometimes I'm going to be speaking in Mando'a and not giving you a translation. Translation for Mando'a spoken in the chapter will be in the comment section for that chapter. Chapter 1. Would it not be wiser, my master, to investigate the governor's accusations before forming a militaristic task force that could unnecessarily escalate the situation? Obi-Wan asked quietly. His master paused, turning slightly to regard Obi-Wan with one dark eye, his silvered eyebrow raised as he hummed softly in consideration. Over the years, Jedi Master Jan Dooku has learned to take his apprentice's feelings and questions quite seriously. The young man at his side was strong in the unifying force and had a talent for premonition and precognition. A caution in questions such as this was often buttressed by a feeling of hesitation and unease in the Force, and those reverberations didn't echo from Obi-Wan himself. While they might not see all paths, Obi-Wan's perceptive questions oft guided them in the right direction.
A wise precaution,
Jan said, one corner of his mouth hitching up slightly. Obi-Wan flushed at the praise, ducking his head.
Come, just because the Council feels I have enough arrogance for any two Jedi, that does not mean you must carry the humility for us both.
Dooku said gently.
You are deserving of praise, my dear.
Obi-Wan's flush deepened at the familiar admonition, but he melted against Dooku when his master gently embraced him, tangling his hands in Dooku's tabards. This, too, was something Jan had learned over the years of their partnership. His soft-hearted Padawan soaked up praise and affection like a sponge, and seemed impervious to arrogance, although his introverted nature and association with Jan often made others assume him haughty. The boy's humility did, in truth, help temper the master's arrogance, and they had each learned much from the other over the years.
We will approach Galadron quietly and learn what we can before acting,
Dooku declared, then pressed a soft kiss to Obi-Wan's brow before releasing him from the hug. As usual, the physical affection flushed Obi-Wan's pale countenance. Jan fought not to chuckle. His Padawan's blushes could likely heat a small space station. It had always been this way, though. When Jan had first offered Obi-Wan a place at his side, the boy had been 3 steps from boarding a transport to Bandamir and the Agricorps for a second time, having been repudiated by one of Dooku's previous Padawans, Qui-Gon Jinn. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon had been separated during the reconciliation of the Civil War on Melida Dan, Qui-Gon returning to the temple with his injured compatriot Tal, and Obi-Wan left behind on the war-torn world to make his way the best he could. Obi-Wan's conscience had demanded he help the young of that planet in their quest for peace, and he'd succeeded emphatically. Qui-Gon's conscience had demanded his friend be treated at best possible speed, and he'd never forgiven his former Padawan for the fact that Tal had been blinded, despite that Tal herself held no grudge. That was more than 5 years ago now, and while Obi-Wan's initial awe of Dooku had faded into loyalty and respect, the Padawan's rough initiate period and short and tumultuous first apprenticeship had all but broken his confidence, making every bit of praise treasured. A 10-day after Obi-Wan made his suggestion of caution, Dooku disembarked from an unassuming trader ship at the spaceport on Galadran with his Padawan at his side. During the course of the journey, both he and Obi-Wan had refreshed their knowledge on the long and war-racked history of Mandalore and its near-galactic neighbors. Since the recent intensification of hostilities, misinformation and covert operations had been widespread. A quiet investigation, rather than an outright acceptance of the mission as outlined by the governor of Galadran, really was the wisest choice. And Jan was a little dismayed that his Padawan had to suggest such a method before Jan realized that for himself. Arrogance Jan reminded himself. It had long been his failing, and Obi-Wan's quiet humility had once again saved the day. Jan hid another grimace at that. He had been somewhat loath to take on another apprentice after his failure with Kamari. She had learned his arrogance well and then exceeded him in that trait. She had viewed it as her right to become a Jedi Knight rather than the privilege it truly was. She had viewed his tutelage, and eventually his body, as hers by right as well, and turning aside her advances when he had at first viewed her as a child and later as an immature and undisciplined adolescent, had been wary. When Jan had heard that this child, who so delighted his own master, would be sent to the Agri-Corps, Dooku had felt called by the Force to intervene despite the still raw hurt of Kamari's death. Heart still aching from the fall of his previous Padawan Xanathos, Obi-Wan's first master, and Jan's previous Padawan, Qui-Gon had felt too betrayed by Obi-Wan's decision to assist the young of Melida Dan to accept the boy as his Padawan a second time. Every day since, Dooku had been thankful. While Qui-Gon had been trying in his own ways and had taught Dooku many lessons, even that troublesome boy hadn't truly taught Dooku anything of humility. While not arrogant, Qui-Gon had never lacked confidence. He lived absolutely in the moment, something that was rare, even among the Jedi. It took a few days on the ground in Galedran, but Jan and Obi-Wan soon learned of the presence of, and accusations against, Jango Fett, the proclaimed Mandalore and leader of the true Mandalorian faction. Despite his profession, ill-regarded by most in the Republic, the bounty hunter was respected widely by the Mando'a diaspora and nearly revered by his followers as the chosen heir of reformer Jaster Meril. From the reports, Dooku couldn't help but be impressed by Fett and his faction, and suspicious of the allegations against them. Born on the agricultural colony world of Concord Dawn, Fett was the son of a journeyman protector, and had been raised in the traditional Mando manner. He had been adopted by Meril after the death of the elder Fetts at the hands of Death Watch commandos led by Tor Vizsla. From what little was recorded beyond that in the official records, Fett was already an almost unmatched warrior despite being only in his early 30s. He also boasted a strong mind for tactics that had seen the true Mandalorians become one of the most sought-after and highly paid mercenary armies in the Mandalorian sector, which boasted more than the galactic average of soldiers for hire. Upon their arrival, the two Jedi ghosted through the capital of Galedran, learning what they could. It was soon apparent that the situation was more than tense. Galedran was a thermal detonator primed to blow. The governor had contracted the true Mandalorians to quell an insurrection, but after the faction had arrived and eliminated the rebels they had been contracted to subdue, civilians had been killed and the true Mandalorians blamed. Moreover, some citizens whispered that those killed under the contract hadn't been terrorists at all, simply citizens agitating for fair governance. If Jan had brought a strike force of Jedi to this world, he was certain things would have gone very wrong very quickly. As it was, they needed more information from both the governor and from Fett and his faction. Knowing the governor was unlikely to be pleased that his request wasn't being followed to the letter, Jan decided a little infiltration was in order, at least in that direction. Fett hopefully would be cooperative with their investigation. Jan didn't think it would be wise, or possible, to surveil the true Mandalorians without attracting their suspicion, and the preliminary evidence didn't support the accusations of wrongdoing against them. Jan would have to hope that honesty was the correct approach, and that it wouldn't end up burning him and his Padawan before this was over. They'd fought their way out of difficult situations before, but none of those difficult situations included hundreds of Mandalorian super commandos trying to kill them, and it wasn't an experience Jan was looking to have firsthand. Carefully, without attracting undue notice, Jedi Master and Padawan made their way to the encampment of the true Mandalorians outside town. Everything was set up with military precision, the tents placed in neat rows, a regular patrol schedule of Beskar-Gam-clad warriors pacing the perimeter. Dooku bowed respectfully to the guard manning the approach, and a step to the left and behind, his apprentice bowed even more deeply.
I am Jedi Master Dooku, and this is my apprentice, Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi. We wish to speak to the Mandalore if he will receive us.
Dooku greeted politely, thankful once more for his lessons on humility with Obi-Wan. A Mandalorian in Beskar was not a good enemy to make, even if the armor was more likely to be Dira steel rather than true lightsaber-resistant Beskar plate. The commando nodded sharply, then waited a few moments. In-helmet comlink, Dooku realized. A useful function.
The Mandalore will see you,
the guard responded in clipped basic, their voice rasping through the vocal recorder on their helmet.
Someone will be here shortly to escort you. You will be escorted at all times in this camp.
Dooku nodded. Mandalorians have a deep-seated distrust of the Jedi, and after a rereading of their history, Dooku did not blame them. The Jedi had, at the behest of the Republic, decimated the Mandalorian people. Even hundreds of years and generations later, much of the surface of Mandalore remained barren desert as a result of orbital bombardment. The Mandalorians hadn't forgotten that preemptive action, called by the Republic the Excision, and by Mandalorians Dralhan, the Annihilation. The difference in terms more than exemplified the way the conflict was remembered by the two sides. As promised, another Mandalorian warrior soon arrived. Like the guard, the escort's Beskar was comprised of modular metal plating secured to sturdy armor weave and topped by a dome helmet with a T-slit visor. There was little other commonality, other than the shield and banners sigil of the true Mandalorian faction, painted on their pauldrons. Their escort led them to a central tent, larger than the others. The interior of the tent was taken up by a large but portable holotable, currently emitting a holomap of the nearby city. Bright dots marked locations, but without additional information, it was impossible for an outsider to guess what the dots meant. What little text there was rendered in Mando letters, sharp verticals that neither Jan nor Obi-Wan could yet decipher. At the back of the tent, a man with short, curling dark hair and warm brown skin sat, bared to the waist and cautiously dabbing antiseptic gel on his wounds. His broad torso was bruised and riddled with scars, most from blaster bolts, but some burns and cuts as well.
Mandalore,
their escort greeted, and the man grunted, then rose. The true Mandalorian sigil was tattooed on his muscular chest above the heart, and his dark eyes were hard.
Jedi,
the Mandalore greeted somewhat coolly, and Dooku and Obi-Wan bowed as if meeting a head of state. Many would argue that was exactly what Jango Fett was.
Mandalore,
Dooku returned in his deep, rich tones.
The governor of Galadron asked for Jedi assistance in quelling an insurrection. Aware as we are of the rampant misinformation spread by all factions in this conflict, we have come to fully and properly investigate accusations of genocide and terrorism against your faction before making any recommendations. This investigation will be carried out with or without your cooperation, but if you are willing to assist us, that will be taken into account no matter the final analysis of the situation. I am deeply troubled by these accusations,
Fett said.
I will acknowledge that there have been heavy losses by all factions, but this sounds as if we are being accused of targeting civilians, which is anathema to the true Mandalorian way. We accept that not all are called to the life of a warrior, although we do not necessarily understand that. But we are devoted to our families, our clans, and the thought that we might purposefully move against the future generation. It is reprehensible to me. You will have the full cooperation of the true Mandalorians.
As Fett spoke, Obi-Wan listened carefully, getting a better sense of the man than was possible through archival research. Fett's voice was low and accented. Mando'a, Obi-Wan thought, was likely Fett's first language, as it was for most born on Concord Dawn. He spoke formally, more formally than Obi-Wan had expected from someone who made his living with a blaster. Obi-Wan shook that thought aside. Fett was a leader of his people, one who used the skills he had been trained in by his mentor. The true Mandalorians likely didn't follow him solely because he was Jaster Maril's son, or because he was a dead-eye shot. They followed because they believed in him, and that required more than just a strong fighter.
In that spirit, I must warn you that the governor is in league with Death Watch.
Fett continued.
I brought my client here to Galadron at his request, to put down a local insurrection. Tor Vizsla was already here when we arrived, although we didn't know it then, and we only found out while carrying out our contracted duties. When our contract was honourably completed and I went to collect remuneration, Death Watch was waiting. I was nearly killed trying to return.
Fett explained, gesturing vaguely at his scar-riddled torso. Dooku glanced slightly to the side, and Obi-Wan dipped his head minutely, trying not to stare at the play of light and shadows across Fett's defined pectoral muscles and abdomen. The Mandalore was sincere.
I believe you, Mando'a, which only makes the accusations more troubling. As I'm sure you're aware, one of my brother Jedi is currently protecting the Duchess Satine Kryze, whose pacifist ideals have placed a target on her back. It is my hope that by cleaning you of these false accusations and exposing Tor Vizsla, if he has done as you say, some sort of agreement can be reached which would benefit all Mandalorians,
Dooku said in his soothing but powerful tones. Fett bowed his head slightly in agreement.
If you are able to do that, Jedi, you will have redeemed much of your order's reputation in the eyes of my people,
Fett said with a slight smirk, shrugging into a light knit top that clung to his broad shoulders and muscular chest.
We do not hold Jedi in high esteem here, and it might behoove you to keep your light swords close while you are about your business. Your advice is much appreciated,
Dooku returned wryly. Obi-Wan could feel his master's slight amusement through the bond they shared, and knew that the sheer confidence of the Mandalore had gained at least a bit of Dooku's respect. The Jedi Master was one who appreciated tradition, but also saw paths for improvement moving forward, an attitude that Obi-Wan thought the Mandalorian members of his faction shared, based on his readings. Over the next few days, Dooku interviewed as many of the true Mandalorians as possible in the camp. Obi-Wan went into the city, carefully asking questions and making observations there, and wondering if the division of labor was because his master had noted the way Obi-Wan's eyes lingered on the Mandalore, the way Obi-Wan blushed whenever he conversed with Fett. Obi-Wan did his best to concentrate on their mission. At night, though, his mind replayed the soft, accented voice of the Mandalore, the warm glint of his dark eyes. He'd had crushes before, but none of them had impacted him quite so strongly, and while he could force himself to concentrate, he meditated more and more frequently on what Fett was coming to mean to him, his growing regard for the man behind the title Mandalore. It didn't hurt that Mandalore Fett was always willing to spend a moment with Obi-Wan to explain a historical precedent or cultural linkage that Obi-Wan, as an outsider, just didn't understand. Every time Obi-Wan looked to the Mandalore, he found those eyes on him. Invariably, the attention made Obi-Wan stammer and blush, and Fett quirk a sly little smile. The other Mando'a seemed more than a bit amused by such exchanges, but they too always made Obi-Wan feel welcome at their fire, sharing stories of their childhoods or myths of their ancestors, or the wide variety of slayers in Mando'a. Before long, it was quite clear to Obi-Wan that Jango Fett, although lacking blood ties with the rest of the clan, had nevertheless made them his family. His officers were his chosen siblings, the bonds of brotherhood forged in battle as strong as those of blood. At times, Obi-Wan heard the quiet reminiscing of Fett with some of the others from Concord Dawn, the wistfulness in their voices as they spoke of the quiet life there on their farms before Death Watch came. Obi-Wan knew integrating so closely with the Mando'a was unwise. He had a tendency to become attached to people, and the Mando'a were welcoming. The more Obi-Wan learned, the more it became clear that the true Mandalorians were honorable people. They had completed their contract and only remained on Galadron to ensure that payment was forthcoming. When bodies began turning up, some of them tangentially linked to the rebels the true Mandalorians had been hired to subdue, the Super Commandos had further restricted their movements to their encampment to ensure they couldn't be accused of acting outside their contractual jurisdiction. Knowing that anecdotes and gut feeling wouldn't be enough to prove innocence if the governor was intent on framing the true Mandalorians, Obi-Wan hunted for evidence of any Death Watch presence. While it was clear that members of the faction were in the area, there was little to connect Death Watch to the disappearances and murders. Stymied by that angle, Obi-Wan set about reconnoitering the governor's mansion in preparation for infiltration. It took almost a 10-day, but Obi-Wan eventually found his way inside the governor's mansion via a service entrance that connected to the kitchens. Disguised as a delivery boy, Obi-Wan was able to slip in and was soon slicing his way into the data core. At first, little of the data appeared helpful, mainly pertaining to taxes and expenditures, events, and ongoing legal actions. Finally, though, Obi-Wan found the secure server. Obi-Wan wasn't someone who understood code slicing at an instinctual level, but he had been highly trained to carry out a variety of missions, and he practiced those skills so they would be at hand in any situation. While it took him longer than he would have liked, Obi-Wan soon found his way past the firewall into the restricted data. There, he found a jackpot! Expansive ledgers documented all manner of corruption and illegal activity, including messages between the governor and Tor Vizsla, leader of the terroristic Death Watch faction. Carefully, Obi-Wan downloaded all the information to an encrypted data chip. He only looked through a few of the files on the terminal before downloading everything, not sure what would end up being important, but knowing that getting as much evidence as possible was crucial. Even beyond his attraction to Jango Fett, Obi-Wan had come to admire and respect the true Mandalorians while staying at their encampment, and he enjoyed learning everything they were willing to share about their history, language, and culture. The true Mandalorians were proud warriors, but not as fanatically traditionalist as Death Watch, who wanted to return to the days of the Mandalorian Crusaders, whose reign of terror had lasted decades and struck at worlds deep into the galactic core. While the true Mandalorians were proud of their imperial-minded ancestors and warrior traditions, they also understood that a culture bent on invasion and conquest would earn them the wrath of the Republic as a whole, a war they could not hope to win no matter their courage and strength. Obi-Wan was always happy to hear their tales, though, and was rapidly picking up the Mando'a language that was more widely spoken here than Galactic Basic. Even after giving his master the information from the governor's mansion, Obi-Wan returned to the city. Dooku was still interviewing the true Mandalorians, recording their accounts of the Civil War, its causes, and the various battles and propaganda campaigns that had been undertaken. The fighting was almost entirely between the true Mandalorians and Death Watch, although they made up a minority of the Mandalorian population. That didn't mean the rest of the Mando diaspora wasn't watching closely to see who would come out on top, and wondering at a chance of reconciliation between the various factions. Obi-Wan listened well, slipping unobtrusively from shadow to shadow. He listened with his ears, but also with the Force, hearing the fear and deception that lay thick on the ground here in Galadran. He might not see shatter points like Master Windu, but Obi-Wan had always been strong in the unifying Force, and while Master Dooku helped him gain familiarity with the living Force as well, he had also helped Obi-Wan refine his prescient abilities so they could be utilized as if seeing the branching paths of probability. Something great and terrible hinged on Galadran, Obi-Wan's senses told him, and the Force echoed with agreement. That night, when he returned to the encampment, Obi-Wan found the tent he'd been accorded with his master and knelt next to their bedrolls, seeking the stillness of the Force. It took a little while longer than usual, his mind still churning, but soon enough he sank into a light meditative trance. Obi-Wan breathed deeply, letting go of his fears and anxieties, quieting his mind, and letting himself sink deeper. With a final sigh, he released the last of his concerns and let the Force carry him. At the beginning of his meditation, Obi-Wan did what his master somewhat teasingly called maintenance, setting his memories of the day so he could access them quickly and accurately and discarding unhelpful emotions. He usually did a short maintenance meditation in the mornings as well, to waken his faculties fully and prepare himself for the day. Once he'd performed that short ritual, Obi-Wan sank even deeper into meditation and began turning over his feelings that what happened at Galadron would be of grave import. He considered the angles of this conflict, who the stakeholders and benefactors were. From what Obi-Wan had gleaned around town, the true Mandalorians were much more respected by the common folk, but the Death Watch much more feared. The new Mandalorians were, well, for all that they were the largest faction, they weren't always terribly well respected by those that didn't share their viewpoints. People could individually respect Duchess Satine. She made for quite the tragic heroine, with her Jedi protector keeping her away from innumerable assassination attempts. And they could understand why someone who had lost so much might wish for an end to all warring. But Mandalorians, the Mando'a, Obi-Wan reminded himself, for that was the name they used for themselves, clung to their rich heritage with a fierceness that exposed them as the warriors they long had been. After about an hour of meditation, Obi-Wan surfaced. The tent was still and dim around him, and so he rose and quickly cleaned his hands and face, then set up their little portable stove outside and warmed 2 portions of field rations. By the time he'd got the food warm enough, though, Master Dooku had arrived, his hands huddled up under his cloak as he sat on the ground near the stove. Obi-Wan could feel the gentle pull of the Force his master used to remain warm, a minor application that many would scoff at, but Dooku was no longer young and chilled easily. Obi-Wan silently split their rations, then knelt at his seated master's side and offered him first choice. When Obi-Wan had become Master Dooku's Padawan, he had taken on care of his teacher. He woke before Master Dooku each morning and prepared first meal, then carefully laid out his master's clothing while Dooku washed up for the day. He prepared mid-meal and late meal as well, kept his master's schedule, and maintained the cleanliness of their quarters. Some Padawans might complain about such division of labor, but Dooku had never assigned these tasks to Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan enjoyed taking care of the older man. It was a silent expression of his gratitude for the education and training his master provided.
"Wrong, Padawan,"
Jan said gently when they had eaten and Obi-Wan had cleaned up, then brewed them each a cup of tea. Obi-Wan knelt at his master's side, gathering his thoughts. After a considering pause, he spoke of his feelings on Galadron's importance and the information he had found that day. As Obi-Wan reported, Jan sipped at his tea, silently projecting his approval and affection.
"You've done well today, Padawan,"
Jan said, earning a shy flush from his apprentice.
"I believe we will soon have to bring our findings to the Council for further orders. Death Watch does not seem to truly have the good of Mandalore as the highest priority, and I feel that between Mandalore, Fett, and Duchess Chris, an agreement could be reached. She is stubborn in the way of youth and with the strength of a true believer, but I think she could be convinced of the true Mandalorian sincerity. It is Death Watch we must keep a close eye on, for they believe in violence as both means and end," Jan said thoughtfully.
"I'll prepare a report for transmission, Master," Obi-Wan offered. "Would you like me to take dictation?" Jan smiled at that, tugging gently at Obi-Wan's braid. He'd never been so well taken care of as he had since taking on Obi-Wan. When his Padawan became a knight, Jan wouldn't know what to do with himself.
"That would be a kindness, Padawan mine,"
Jan said fondly, and Obi-Wan nodded, standing to grab a datapad. He took down his master's report first, carefully transcribing as Dooku spoke. As he dictated, Jan tapped thoughtfully at his chin. When he was finished, Obi-Wan handed over the datapad for any edits Jan might wish to make. While Jan was editing, Obi-Wan wrote his own report, adding detail and elaborating based on the questions his master had asked. They submitted their reports, knowing it might be a few days before they gained a response. The Jedi Council wasn't always the fastest acting organization, although the complexity of the situation would hopefully speed their reply. There had been no word a few days later, though, when Jan and Obi-Wan looked up sharply in unison from their separate locations in the camp and Galadron City. Trouble was coming, and the Force was screaming in warning. Obi-Wan excused himself politely from his conversation, slipping away into shadows, and then speeding for the true Mandalorian camp. About a click outside of the camp perimeter, Obi-Wan slid to a stop, hurriedly quieting himself and disguising his presence. Mercenaries. No, something more. Darksiders. A chill swept down Obi-Wan's spine as their outfits registered. Not just Darksiders, Mandalorians. They decimated a Jedi transport years back, around the time Obi-Wan was first taken as a Padawan and become something like boogeymen to all the younglings in the meantime. Master Dooku's previous Padawan, Obi-Wan knew, had died on that transport, although she'd been on board without permission. Kamari's death still haunted Master Dooku. The presence of Mandalorian assassins could in no way be a good thing, especially as they seemed to be preparing an assault on the true Mandalorian encampment. "Master?" Obi-Wan sent through their bond and felt his master's attention settle on him. "One click out. Looks like Mandalorian. They're digging in ambush positions. It might take me a little longer to get to you."
"Be careful, dear one," Master Dooku responded. "I'd rather you return to town than take unnecessary risks."
"I belong at your side," Obi-Wan replied firmly and received a swell of affection and caution in turn. Obi-Wan sent affirmation at that and drew his own force presence in close, a trick Master Dooku had taught him fairly recently. Carefully masking his presence in every way possible, Obi-Wan passed through the line of Mandalorian, noting that their numbers were augmented with commandos in armor marked with Death Watch colors and sigils. Had their transmission been hacked? Obi-Wan wondered, trying to note the strength and positions of the attackers as they moved. When Obi-Wan finally reached the gate, he was nearly breathless with fear. Taking deep breaths, he paused, acknowledging his fear and its validity, then releasing it into the Force. Pushing his hood back slightly so he could be identified, he nodded at the guard and was waved through into the camp. Reaching out, Obi-Wan felt for his master and walked rapidly to his side. He found Master Dooku with the Mandalore, Fett deftly buckling on his Beskar. "Death Watch and Mandalorian," Obi-Wan reported as he entered. "About a click out, I counted at least 50 of each on the approach from town, and I felt more circling around the other sides of the camp. They seem to be digging in, rather preparing for an immediate attack. Since they didn't attack as soon as they arrived, I'd guess we have a little time, although I couldn't say how long." Jango muttered a few choice phrases in Mando'a, then began clipping spare blaster charge packs to his utility belt. Obi-Wan was faintly amused by the almost blasé reaction and looked to his master, intending to raise an eyebrow in silent invitation to share amusement. But Master Dooku's face was a mask of glacial fury, and when Obi-Wan brushed their bond, he could feel the cold anger his master nursed. "Master," Obi-Wan murmured, going to Master Dooku and taking his large hands, gently rubbing his long, elegant fingers.
"Dooku?"
Fett asked, raising an eyebrow. Their respect for one another had grown over the weeks, and even force-blind as he was, Jango could feel Dooku's anger. Fett had never imagined Jedi were capable of the implacable rage Dooku was emanating. "Let it go, Master. It will not bring him back," Obi-Wan gently urged, reaching up to rub his master's tense shoulders. "Let it go." Dooku took a deep, shaking breath and released his anger. No, Obi-Wan was right. It would not bring his erstwhile Padawan back. And even if it could, she had been lost to him even before her death. Glancing over at Fett, Obi-Wan gave a wry little quirk of the lips at the man's raised eyebrow. "My sister Padawan was killed by the Mandalorians some years ago. They slaughtered a Jedi delegation," Obi-Wan explained.
"And they are still alive?"
Fett asked somewhat incredulously. "Revenge is not the Jedi way," Obi-Wan said by rote. Fett's other eyebrow rose in silent disbelief. "Well, it isn't supposed to be," Obi-Wan conceded with a slight smile.
"It is the Mando way,"
Fett said, his voice sliding into a lightly teasing tone, and Obi-Wan looked back to him in surprise.
"Mandalore? You have perhaps saved my people, Jatika,"
Fett said, the gentleness of his voice belied by a bloodthirsty smile.
"For that I would owe you a great debt, and I dislike owing a man a debt. The Mandalorians have made themselves my enemy twice over by hurting your clan and by hurting mine. They will not survive."
It was a pragmatic concept, but Obi-Wan was touched, nevertheless, that the Mandalore desired to protect their family. He was something other than touched at the affectionate diminutive, his cheeks heating. "Little Jedi," Fett had called him, and it sparked a warmth deep inside him that he knew he ought not feed.
Revenge may not be a Jedi concept, and Kamari was lost to us before the Mandalore killed her. But the Jedi they slew deserve justice, and I am grateful, Mandalore, for your assistance in that matter.
Dooku said, straightening and looking over at Fett.
We came here on duty, Mandalore, but you and your people have earned my trust, and it is not given lightly. It is clear that at least today, your enemies and ours are the same.
Fett nodded, pleased at the reciprocation of friendship and trust, such as could be found between Jedi and Mando'a.
Dear one,
Yan addressed his Padawan, and Obi-Wan looked up at him instantly. Affection and obedience lit in his eyes. Yan had to smile at that and cupped his boy's cheek. His dear Padawan, who had shown during this mission that he was nearly ready to be a knight. Yan wasn't yet ready to let him go, though, and so he would spend some time soon compiling more things to teach Obi-Wan.
Make contact with the Council, transmit our findings at best possible encryption, given our limited time and allotted bandwidth, along with a warning of what we face here. We are only two, and we shall do our best against the Mandalore, but they are not without ability in the Force, and their willingness to work with others on this scale is unprecedented. When the time comes, I leave the Mandalore's protection to you.
Obi-Wan nodded. While they were both more than proficient with their sabers, his master's preferred form of Makashi was of greatest effect in one-on-one duels against an opponent also using a lightsaber. Protection required a different style, and while Obi-Wan had studied all of the forms save Vrapad, he had eventually chosen to specialize in Saresu, a defensive endurance-based style that worked as well against blasters as sabers. It was an ideal form for use and protection.
As you will it, my master. May the Force be with you,
Obi-Wan said, hugging his master and then stepping back and giving a formal bow.
Kenobi,
Fett called as Obi-Wan headed for the tent's entrance. Obi-Wan turned, flushing slightly under the Mandalore's dark gaze. The weight of that stare was almost as perceptible as it touched Obi-Wan, and he swallowed thickly, reminding himself again that Jango Fett had better things to do than put up with mooning Padawans.
Mandalore,
Obi-Wan responded respectfully with a dip of the head.
Can you fight in Beskar?
Fett asked.
I have never attempted it, Obi-Wan admitted. I have trained in greaves and gauntlets, but I've never worn torso armor or a helmet. If it is fitted properly and I have the chance to adjust before we are in battle, I believe it would be worth attempting. Someone will come to measure you,
Fett declared, and Obi-Wan nodded, then retreated to contact the Jedi Council as his master had commanded. It took a while to get everything compiled, and then to compress the files and encrypt them properly. Obi-Wan worked as quickly as he could without making mistakes, knowing time was of the essence. They probably had a little leeway before Death Watch and the Mandalore attacked, but Obi-Wan did not want to bet the lives of the Mandalore and his true Mandalorians on that belief. Since beginning their investigations, Obi-Wan had come to wholly believe in the tenets the true Mandalorians espoused, despite knowing it was unwise to develop an opinion on matters of Mandalorian philosophy. As a Jedi investigator, he ought to remain impartial. They were there to resolve matters between the true Mandalorians and the governor of Galadran, not intervene in the wider warring of the clans. Obi-Wan had just begun transmitting when a team of armorers showed up. Leaving the encoder running, Obi-Wan let them measure his chest and shoulders and neck and spine and tried on a few pairs of gauntlets, gloves, greaves, and other armor pieces. When they left, Obi-Wan was promised a full set of Beskar by nightfall. Obi-Wan accepted, then returned to monitor the uplink. Gauntlets and greaves arrived shortly, along with a thermoregulating bodysuit and armor-weave flight suit. Obi-Wan shivered as he stripped off his tunic and leggings, then pulled on the bodysuit and flight suit before putting his boots back on. He pulled the greaves and gauntlets on next, then began moving slowly through some of the open-handed training exercises Jedi learned from childhood to determine the range of motion the armor allowed. Plates to protect his thighs and armor for his pelvis arrived next, and Obi-Wan fastened them on, then went back to exercises until they sent his shoulder pauldrons and the plating for his chest, torso, and back. Obi-Wan was able to move well in the Beskar Gam, although the T-slit in the helmet limited his vision somewhat until he figured out how to turn on and utilize the interior heads-up display. He practiced, though, both with his saber lit and with open hands, ensuring that he had full range of motion and that the weight of the armor would not slow him. It definitely felt different, but it didn't feel wrong. When he was satisfied the Beskar Gam wouldn't impede his ability to protect the Mandalore, Obi-Wan returned to his side. Fett was fully armed and armored by then, and standing with his loyal lieutenants in the command tent conveying his orders. Obi-Wan listened carefully, setting names and positions to memory. Some of the warriors were familiar already, but in the heat of battle misremembering a name might cost a life, and that was not a risk Obi-Wan was willing to take.